a legendary commander whose name struck fear into the greatest empire of antiquity. Legend has it that the Persian king Darius I fled when he heard the name Miltiades. But was that really the case? Today, we will delve into history to uncover the truth about the man who taught the Persians fear and understand the real events behind this myth. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, and let's get started. Miltiades the Younger was not a random figure on the Athenian political scene. He belonged to the Simonids, one of the richest and most influential aristocratic families in Athens. His father, Cimon the Elder, was famous throughout Hellas not so much for his political successes as for his victories in the Olympic chariot races, an achievement that in those days brought fame comparable to the triumph of a military commander. It was a family accustomed to power, wealth, and primacy. Miltiades himself inherited not only wealth but also a sharp mind, multiplied by ambition. And so, around 520 BC, Athens turned its attention to a distant and strategically invaluable peninsula, Chersonosus Thracian. Today, we know it as Gallipoli. In ancient times, this place was the key to the Black Sea, the gateway through which grain from the Black Sea steppes flowed into Athens. Controlling Chersonosus meant controlling the city's food security. But there was a problem. This land was wild and inhabited by warlike Thracian tribes who were constantly at war with each other and raided Greek settlements. The wind from the strait ruffles the hair of the gray-bearded elders. They stand on a hill, looking out over the troubled waters of the Hellespont. These are the Dolonians, one of the Thracian tribes tormented by the raids of their neighbors. The oracle at Delphi gave them vague advice to bring to their land the first person who invited them into their home. Their long wanderings led them to Athens, where, strangers and confused, they wandered the streets until they met Miltiades. Noticing their unusual appearance, he invited them to his home, showing aristocratic hospitality. For him, it was a gesture of courtesy. For them, it was a sign from the gods. According to Herodotus, this is how the story of Miltiades' reign in Chersonesos began. Athens, interested in the stability of the region, willingly released one of its most active aristocrats. For them, it was a way to strengthen their influence without getting involved in direct warfare. For Miltiades, it was a chance to build his own, virtually independent state. Upon arriving at his destination, he wasted no time. He was not just an Athenian governor. He became a tyrant, a ruler with absolute power. It is worth noting that in those days, the term tyrant did not yet carry the purely negative connotation that we attach to it today. It simply meant a sole ruler who had not come to power by inheritance. Miltiades assembled a force of 500 mercenaries, built a wall across the narrowest point of the peninsula to protect it from land attacks, and married Hegesippole, daughter of the Thracian king Olorus. This dynastic marriage secured him allies and strengthened his position among the local tribes. He ruled harshly, pragmatically, and effectively, turning the troubled border into his personal fiefdom under the protectorate of Athens. Miltiades' peaceful reign ended when a shadow of unprecedented power appeared on the horizon. The Achaemenid Empire, led by King Darius I, expanded with the relentless force of nature. Around 513 BC, the Persian army crossed into Europe and conquered Thrace. Miltiades' independent principality suddenly became part of a vast Persian satrapy. He, a proud Athenian aristocrat and autocratic tyrant, was now merely a vassal, obliged to pay tribute and provide troops at the great king's first request. It was in this seemingly humiliating position that Miltiades learned the most valuable lesson of his life. Darius I embarked on a grand campaign against the Scythians, nomadic tribes inhabiting the Black Sea steppes. To ferry their gigantic army across the Danube, called the Ister in ancient times, the Persians built a huge pontoon bridge out of tied-together ships. Darius entrusted the guarding of this structure to his new Greek vassals, among whom was Miltiades. Imagine this scene, a wide, muddy river. On one bank, an endless stream of warriors from all corners of the empire. The Persian guard in their colorful uniforms, archers from Media, Egyptian spearmen, Phoenician sailors. The air is filled with the clamor of dozens of languages, the neighing of thousands of horses, the creaking of carts. And on the other bank, near the bridge, stands a group of Greek tyrants. Among them is Miltiades. He is not just watching, he is analyzing. He sees this colossal but motley crowd. He notes how Persian commanders give orders through interpreters, how slowly and clumsily this military machine moves, how much it depends on the delivery of provisions and on this very bridge, which he is now guarding. It was here, on the banks of the Danube, that an episode took place which, according to Herodotus, revealed Miltiades' true nature for the first time. The Scythians, having exhausted the Persians with their guerrilla tactics, sent messengers to the Greeks with a proposal. Destroy the bridge, and Darius's army would be trapped, doomed to perish in the endless steppes. A dispute arose among the Greek rulers. Miltiades ardently supported the Scythians' proposal. He convinced the others that this was a unique chance to crush the power of Persia in one fell swoop and restore freedom to all Greek cities. However, another point of view, expressed by Histiaeus, the tyrant of Miletus, prevailed. He reasonably pointed out that their power in the cities was based solely on Persian support. If Darius died, the people would overthrow them. The Greeks waited. They only pretended to dismantle the bridge to deceive the Scythians, and when Darius's exhausted army returned, the crossing was still in place. The king was saved. But for Miltiades, this campaign was a real learning experience. He saw the Persian army from the inside. He realized that its main strength, its numbers, was also its main weakness. This huge horde was slow, vulnerable to attacks from the flanks, and critically dependent on supply lines and the fleet. He realized that the heart of the army was the king himself and his guard of immortals. If a strike were to be made at the center, at this heart, then panic could engulf the entire giant body. He took this knowledge, gained as a submissive vassal, with him. He did not yet know when and where he would have the chance to apply it, but he was sure that such a day would come. This experience is similar to that of an engineer working for a huge technological giant, studying all its processes, bureaucracy, and technical vulnerabilities from the inside. When he leaves to start his own small startup, he is not afraid of the giant. He knows its weak points and is ready to strike precisely where the defenses are thinnest. The events on the Danube did not pass without a trace for Darius. He remembered the bold Greek who dared to suggest destroying the bridge and condemning his army to death. Miltiades became not just a vassal to the Persian court, but a problem asset. He was too smart, too independent, and most dangerously, he now knew how the Persian military machine worked. This information in one man's head was more dangerous than an entire rebellious city. And the rebellion was not long in coming. Around 499 BC, the coast of Ionia, the Greek heart of Asia Minor, erupted in rebellion. The irony of fate was that its instigators were the very people who had saved Darius on the Danube, the tyrants Aristagoras and Histiaeus. Driven by personal ambition and fear of the king's wrath for the failed expedition, they raised the banner of freedom, calling on the Greek cities to throw off the Persian yoke. For Miltiades, this was the signal he had been waiting for. He was not a naive idealist, he was a pragmatist to the core. The uprising was his chance. He immediately joined the rebellion, expelling the Persian garrisons from his territory and, more importantly, capturing the strategically important islands of Lemnos and Imbros, which he then placed under Athenian control. This was not simply an act of defiance, it was a calculated geopolitical move. It expanded Athens' sphere of influence while depriving the Persian fleet of convenient bases in the northern Aegean Sea. At first, the uprising seemed successful. With the support of a small contingent from Athens and Eretria, the Ionians reached Sardis, the capital of the satrapy, and burned the city. This fire lit up the entire Mediterranean. For the Greeks, it was a symbol of audacity. For Darius, it was an indelible insult. Legend has it that, upon learning of the role of the Athenians, he ordered his servant to repeat to him 3 times every day at lunch, "Lord, remember the Athenians." Revenge became his obsession. But the flames of rebellion burned brightly, though not for long. The Persian Empire, having recovered from the initial shock, began to methodically tighten the noose. Huge armies were thrown into suppressing the rebellion. City after city fell under the blows of superior forces. The climax came with the naval battle of Lade in 494 BC, where the combined Greek fleet was utterly defeated due to betrayal and a lack of unified command. After that, the fate of Ionia was sealed. For Miltiades, this meant disaster. He became one of the main targets. The Persian fleet, now reigning supreme at sea, headed for Chersonesus. Miltiades realized that his small kingdom was doomed. A desperate race against time began. He loaded his treasures onto 5 triremes and attempted to slip past the Phoenician squadrons patrolling the Hellespont. It was an escape worthy of a Hollywood blockbuster. The Persian ships spotted the fugitives and gave chase. 4 of Miltiades' ships, including the one carrying his eldest son Metiochus, were cut off and captured. Miltiades himself on his flagship managed to break away and head out to the open sea, heading for the only place where he could hope for salvation, Athens. He lost everything, his kingdom, his fortune, his son. But he learned another invaluable lesson from this disaster. You cannot fight the Persians in a disorganized manner. You need a united will, iron discipline, and a commander who will not waver. His return to Athens in 493 BC was far from triumphant. He was a refugee, an exiled ruler. Moreover, he was not immediately welcomed with open arms, but with a lawsuit. His political opponents, primarily the powerful Alcmaeonid clan, accused him of what he was indeed guilty of, establishing a tyranny in Chersonesus. It was a paradox of Athenian democracy. The man who had done more than anyone else to fight Persian tyranny was now himself accused of tyranny. The trial was a show trial. The prosecutors reminded the citizens that Miltiades ruled as an autocrat, maintained mercenaries, and acted without the sanction of the Athenian assembly. This was true. But on Miltiades' side was another, more compelling truth, which the Athenians were beginning to realize viscerally. The Persian threat was no longer something distant, happening in Ionia. It was at their doorstep. Miltiades' stories about the power and cruelty of the empire, about his own flight, about the fate of the fallen Greek cities made a much greater impression on the Athenians than legal formalities. They looked at this stern, battle-hardened aristocrat and saw not a tyrant, but a man who had looked the enemy in the face and knew how to fight him. In the end, he was acquitted. The Athenians instinctively understood that they would need such a captain in the coming storm. Soon he was elected to the position of strategist, one of 10 military leaders elected annually to command the army. Meanwhile, the clouds were gathering. Darius had not forgotten the Athenians. In 490 BC, a huge expeditionary force under the command of the experienced generals Datis and Artaphernes set sail across the Aegean Sea. Their goal was not simply conquest, but a punitive operation. They were to punish Athens and Eretria for helping the Ionian rebels. The Persians acted methodically, capturing island after island. After a short siege, Eretria fell due to betrayal. The city was burned, and its inhabitants were taken into slavery deep into Asia. It was a vivid demonstration of what awaited the rebellious. The Persian fleet then headed for Attica. The landing site was suggested by a man who knew Athens like the back of his hand, Hippias, the deposed Athenian tyrant who had found refuge at the Persian court. He pointed to the Marathon plain. The choice was ideal from the point of view of Persian tactics. It was a wide, flat space by the sea, perfectly suited to the deployment of their main trump card, their numerous and formidable cavalry, against which the Greek hoplites had no effective antidote. The news of the Persian landing at Marathon threw Athens into a state of panic. The popular assembly buzzed like an agitated beehive. What to do? Lock themselves in the city and wait for the siege, hoping for the strength of the newly built walls? Or go out to meet the enemy and give battle in the open field, risking everything? The opinions of the 10 strategists were divided exactly in half. 5 were in favor of defense, 5 in favor of an immediate attack. It was a moment of absolute indecision, when the fate of Western civilization hung in the balance.
It was at this critical moment that Miltiades came to the fore. He did not simply call for battle. He radiated confidence based on knowledge. He addressed the supreme commander, Polemarch Callimachus, whose voice was decisive. We do not know the exact words of his speech, but Herodotus conveys its essence, and it sounds like a wake-up call. Miltiades spoke not of blind courage, but of cold calculation. He explained that sitting under siege was a slow death. Discord would inevitably break out in the city, and traitors would be found, alluding to his enemies, the Alcmaeonids, who would open the gates to the enemy, as had happened in Eretria. Delay played into the hands of the Persians. The only chance was to strike now, before the enemy had recovered from the landing, before their army was fully organized on the shore. "It is now up to you, Callimachus," he said, "to make the Athenians slaves, or, by freeing them, to leave a lasting memory of yourself. If we fight before the rot of treason takes root in the hearts of some of the Athenians, we can win, provided the gods are impartial." This was not just the speech of a commander, but of a psychologist and politician. He appealed to Callimachus's honor, painting a picture of glory, while at the same time frightening him with the threat of internal betrayal. And his words, backed by his reputation as a man who knew the Persians, had an effect. Callimachus voted for battle. The Athenian army, about 10,000 hoplites, joined by a small detachment of 1,000 warriors from their loyal ally, the city of Plataea, marched to Marathon. They took up positions in the foothills, blocking the Persians' path to Athens. For several days, the armies stood facing each other. It was a battle of nerves. The Persians, confident in their numerical superiority, their forces are estimated at between 25,000 and 100,000 men, including the naval command, were in no hurry to attack the Greeks on terrain that was unsuitable for cavalry. They waited for the Athenians to falter or for their supporters in the city itself to stage a coup. Miltiades also waited, but he was not waiting for a miracle, but for an opportunity. Every day he observed the Persian camp, analyzing their routine, movements, and organization. And he noticed a key detail. The Persian cavalry, their most formidable weapon, had disappeared somewhere. Ancient sources do not give a precise answer as to what happened. Modern historians put forward the most plausible version. Datis and Artaphernes, tired of waiting, decided to divide their forces. They loaded the cavalry and part of the infantry back onto the ships to bypass Attica and launch a surprise attack on Athens itself from the sea, from the port of Phalerum, while the main Athenian army was tied up in battle at Marathon. It was a bold but risky plan, and Miltiades understood this. The enemy had voluntarily deprived itself of its main advantage. This was the very chance he had been waiting for. On the day the command rotated to him, he gave an order that seemed insane to his contemporaries. He ordered an attack. But not just an attack, a run. The distance between the armies was about 8 stadia, approximately 1.5 kilometers. The Athenian hoplites, clad in heavy bronze armor weighing up to 30 kilograms, had to cover this distance at a run under a hail of arrows from the Persian archers. According to Herodotus, when the Persians saw this, they, quote, considered the Athenians to be madmen, doomed to certain death, seeing how few they were and how they rushed at the enemy without cavalry or archers. But it was not madness. It was a brilliant tactical calculation. Firstly, running reduced the time spent under fire. Secondly, it gave the phalanx's attack incredible kinetic energy. It was not just a wall of shields, it was a battering ram rushing at full speed. And thirdly, it was a shock. No one had ever attacked the Persian army in this way before. But the main surprise awaited the Persians in the formation of the Greek army. Miltiades, knowing that his front was shorter than the Persian one and that the enemy could easily outflank him, took an unprecedented risk. He stretched out his phalanx, deliberately weakening the center, which was only a few rows deep. Instead, he strengthened the flanks as much as possible, which were commanded by himself and the Polemarch Callimachus. This was a violation of all the canons of Greek tactics, where the center was always the strongest part. He was betting everything on one strike. The battle unfolded exactly according to his plan. When the armies clashed, the powerful Persian center, consisting of elite Persian and Scythian warriors, easily broke through the thin Greek line. The Persians rushed forward with victorious cries, pursuing the retreating Athenians. It seemed to them that victory was already in the bag. But at the same time, something completely different was happening on the flanks. The reinforced Athenian wings, like two hammers, crushed the opposing troops of the vassal peoples that made up the Persian flanks. And instead of pursuing the fleeing enemy, they showed incredible discipline, stopping and turning inward. And then the trap snapped shut on the Persian center. The warriors, who had just considered themselves victorious, suddenly found themselves under attack from both flanks and from the rear. A massacre began. The motley Persian infantry, accustomed to fighting in loose formation, found themselves trapped in a vice by heavily armed hoplites. It was no longer a battle, but a beating. Panic seized the Persians, and they rushed to flee to their ships. But even here, the Athenians did not stop. They pursued the enemy to the very water's edge, rushing into the surf to set fire to and capture the ships. The battle on the shore was desperate and bloody. It was here that the Polemarch Callimachus died a heroic death.
Here, too, the brother of the great playwright Aeschylus, Cynegeirus, grabbed the stern of an enemy ship and did not let go, even when his hand was cut off with a sword. The Athenians managed to capture 7 Persian ships, but the rest of the fleet managed to get out to sea. The battle on land had been won, but the war was not yet over. Miltiades knew that the Persian fleet, which still had cavalry on board, would now head for defenseless Athens. And he again made a decision that required superhuman effort from his men. Immediately after the battle, without giving his soldiers a moment's rest, he led his army on a forced march back to the city. When the Persian ships rounded Cape Sunion and approached the Athenian port of Phalerum, they were astonished and enraged to see the gleam of shields on the hills above the city belonging to the very army they had just considered defeated. Realizing that the moment had been lost, Datis and Artaphernes gave the order to retreat. The first Persian punitive expedition ended in complete failure. Miltiades did not simply win, he humiliated an invincible empire. When the last sail of the Persian fleet disappeared into the sea mist, silence reigned on the Athenian hills, broken only by the heavy breathing of thousands of exhausted warriors. They did not shout with joy. They simply stood, leaning on their spears and shields, and looked at the emptying bay. The realization of what they had accomplished came slowly, in waves. They, a handful of citizen militiamen, had just put to flight an army that had terrified kingdoms from the Indus to Egypt. It was unthinkable. Bodies lay strewn across the field of Marathon. According to estimates that would later be recorded in the annals, 192 Athenian citizens and 11 Plataeans had fallen. Each loss was a personal tragedy for a city where everyone knew each other. But next to them, on the sand and in the coastal marshes, lay, according to Herodotus, 6,400 soldiers of the Persian king. The contrast was staggering and served as the best proof of divine favor. The burial of the fallen became an act of national importance. For the first time in the history of Athens, the fallen heroes were not taken to the city cemetery of Kerameikos. They were buried right there, on the field of their glory, with a huge mound, the Soros, piled over their mass grave, which still towers over the plain today as an eternal monument to their sacrifice. Being buried on the battlefield became the highest posthumous honor, previously reserved only for mythical heroes. Miltiades, thus, did not simply win the battle, he created a pantheon of new Athenian saints. It was during these days that a legend was born that would eclipse even the battle itself. The story of the runner Phidippides or Philippides, who ran 42 kilometers from Marathon to Athens only to fall dead with the cry, "Rejoice, Athenians, we have won," is a later embellishment. Herodotus, our main source, does mention Phidippides, but as a messenger sent to Sparta for help before the battle. He ran 240 kilometers in 2 days, a feat that is incredible in itself. The story of his deadly run to Athens appears centuries later in the works of Plutarch and Lucian, and is most likely a beautiful compilation of several real events.
But the myth proved stronger than the fact because it perfectly reflected the essence of what had happened. Victory was achieved at the limit of human strength, at the cost of life, and the news of it was as important as the victory itself. And what was happening in Persia at that time? The news of the defeat took weeks to reach the capital, Susa. One can imagine the scene at Darius's court. Messengers who had traveled thousands of kilometers fell prostrate before the throne, not daring to raise their eyes.
Their report sounded like madness. The army had not simply been repelled, it had been crushed and humiliated by a handful of townspeople. Elite regiments, which had put dozens of nations to the sword, fled from the militia. For Darius, the ruler of the world, this was not just a military defeat. It was a personal challenge, a slap in the face to his divine status. The shame of Datis and Artaphernes was indelible. But the king's wrath fell not so much on them as on the distant city that dared to challenge him. From that moment on, revenge on Athens became for him not just a political task, but a personal vendetta. He began preparations for a new campaign, much larger in scale, which was to wipe Athens off the face of the earth. Miltiades' victory at Marathon did not end the war. It only gave the Greeks a 10-year respite and forced Persia to prepare for a serious invasion. Upon returning to Athens, Miltiades found himself at the height of fame, unmatched by any Athenian before him. He was not merely a victorious strategist, he was the savior of his homeland, a living deity. The popular assembly was ready to fulfill his every wish. And here, at the height of his power, Miltiades made a fatal mistake, which the Greeks called hubris, pride that blinds a hero and leads him to his doom. He decided to use his enormous authority for personal gain and to settle old scores. He appeared before the popular assembly and demanded that he be given a fleet of 70 ships, an army, and money, without explaining the purpose of the expedition. He only promised that he would lead the Athenians to a country where they would find so much gold that they could fill their houses with it. Enchanted by his fame, the Athenians agreed. Miltiades' target was the rich island of Paros, which during the Persian invasion had been forced to give the enemy one of its ships. That was the official reason. The real reason, according to rumors, was personal. Miltiades had a long-standing feud with one of the noblemen of Paros. The expedition, which had begun so promisingly, turned into a disgrace. Miltiades besieged Paros and demanded a huge tribute of 100 talents of silver from the inhabitants. The Parasonians refused and prepared for a long defense. The siege lasted 26 days. The Athenian army suffered losses, and the glory of their leader faded with each passing day. In desperation, Miltiades attempted to take the city by trickery. According to one version of events, he entered into secret negotiations with a priestess of the temple of Demeter, who promised to help him. At night, he climbed over the wall of the sacred precinct to receive some kind of pledge from her. But, frightened by the noise or a bad omen, he rushed back. Jumping over the fence, he fell badly and severely injured his hip. The wound became infected and gangrene set in. Having suffered complete failure, sick and humiliated, Miltiades was forced to lift the siege and return to Athens. His return was the complete opposite of his triumph after Marathon. Instead of a hero, the city greeted him as a deceiver and squanderer of public funds. His political enemies, the Alcmaeonids, whom he had overshadowed with his fame, did not miss their chance. He was charged with deceiving the Athenian people. The chief prosecutor was Xanthippus, father of the future great Pericles. The trial of Miltiades became one of the most dramatic spectacles in the history of Athens. Still recovering from his wounds, he was carried into the assembly on a stretcher. He was unable to speak in his own defense. His friends spoke on his behalf, reminding the people of Marathon, of the city that had been saved, of the Persians who had been defeated. But the Athenians were relentless. They saw before them not a hero, but a man who had abused their trust. The democracy he had saved now judged him with all severity. Initially, the prosecutors demanded the death penalty for him, but the memory of Marathon softened the hearts of the judges. The death sentence was replaced by a huge fine of 50 talents, an amount equivalent to the cost of building 50 warships.
For Miltiades, it was the end. He could not pay such a fine and was thrown into debtor's prison. His wound continued to fester. Shortly after the trial, in filth and obscurity, the victor of Marathon, the man who had taught the Persians fear, died of gangrene. His debt was later paid by his son, Cimon, who sold all his property and married his own sister to obtain her rich dowry. Thus ended the life of Miltiades. His fate is a classic Greek tragedy of rise and fall, of how glory can breed pride and pride can lead to destruction. But his legacy proved more enduring than his life. The tactics he employed at Marathon, flexible formation, swift attack, flanking maneuvers, became part of all military textbooks. He showed the Greeks that the Persians could and should be defeated, that numerical superiority could be overcome with intelligence and discipline. The victory at Marathon instilled incredible self-confidence in the Athenians, becoming the starting point for the birth of their maritime power and the flourishing of democracy. And although Darius never fled at the mere mention of Miltiades' name, the fear that this Athenian instilled in the hearts of Persian commanders was very real. It was not fear of the name, but of a new, incomprehensible, and deadly style of warfare that changed the balance of power in the ancient world forever. His reign in Chersonesos was not just a sinecure for a spoiled aristocrat. It was a harsh school of survival on the front line of civilization. There was no popular assembly to appeal to, nor city walls to hide behind. There were only treacherous Thracian kings, constant raids, and the need to make decisions instantly, relying only on his wits and his sword. He learned not only to command, but also to bargain, to make alliances, and to betray them when necessary. This experience hardened him, transforming him from a city politician into a true border lord, accustomed to absolute power and personal responsibility. He understood that order and security were not gifts from the gods, but were forged with iron and will. This personal experience of defeat was compounded by a family drama that speaks volumes about the methods of the Persian Empire. His son, Miltiades, captured during a desperate escape, was not executed or thrown into prison. Darius I acted much more subtly. He treated the young man with royal mercy. He showered him with gifts, gave him an estate in the depths of Persia, and married him to a noble Persian woman. Miltiades' children were already considered subjects of the great king. This was not an act of generosity, but a sophisticated political game. Darius was showing the Greek elites that obedience was rewarded, while resistance led to destruction. For Miltiades, this was another blow. The empire did not simply kill its enemies, it absorbed them, dissolving their families and their future into itself. He was fighting not just an army, but a civilizational machine capable of both cruelty and seduction. It was this deep understanding of the enemy's psychology that made his order to flee at Marathon not just a tactical move, but a cultural shock. Persian military doctrine was based on suppressing the enemy from a distance. Their strength lay in clouds of arrows that were supposed to break the enemy's spirit, thin their ranks, and make them falter even before hand-to-hand combat. The Persians expected the Greeks to slowly, step by step, advance towards them under this deadly rain. The hoplites run, the dromos, was a complete rejection of this scenario. It was a bold statement. Your arrows are nothing to us. We will not wait for you to shoot us. We are coming to you ourselves to settle everything in a real battle, face to face. For the Greek warrior, the essence of battle was agon, competition, close combat, where strength, valor, and fortitude played a decisive role. The wall of bronze and spears rushing towards them was something alien and terrifying to the Persians. They saw not just soldiers, but fanatics obsessed with the thirst for battle, which caused the first psychological breakdown in their ranks even before the clash. Even his last fatal mistake, the expedition to Paros, on closer inspection looks like more than just an act of greed. Miltiades, like no one else, understood that Marathon was not the end of the war, but only the first battle. He knew that the Persians would return, and this time their fleet would be even larger. The Cyclades archipelago, at the heart of which lay Paros, was a natural bridge from Asia to Greece. Controlling these islands meant controlling the sea lanes. Paros, with its rich resources and convenient harbor, was an ideal forward base for the Persian fleet. Capturing the island would be a brilliant strategic move, a preemptive strike that would deprive the enemy of a key foothold for a future invasion. Miltiades probably saw this not just as a plundering raid, but as a crucial preventive operation to ensure the security of Athens. His tragedy was that, accustomed to acting as an autocratic tyrant in Chersonesos, he did not deem it necessary to explain his strategic plan to the Athenian demos. He demanded blind trust, but Athenian democracy, even though he had saved it, was no longer prepared to grant anyone such unlimited power. He thought in terms of grand strategy, but he was judged by the laws of peacetime and accused of embezzlement and fraud. His failure was not in the idea, but in the arrogance with which he tried to implement it, forgetting that he was no longer a tyrant on a distant frontier, but just one of 10 strategists in a city that valued freedom above genius. It was a clash not only of tactics, but also of technology. The Greek hoplite, clad in 30 kilograms of bronze and carrying a large shield called an aspis, was a living fortress. He was opposed by a Persian infantryman whose main protection, a large woven shield called a spara and quilted armor, was practically useless against the long Greek spear in close combat. Miltiades did not rely on a firefight, but on a crushing blow, where this superiority in defense became absolute. And in this battle, the Athenians were not alone. The arrival of 1,000 Plataean hoplites, the entire fighting population of the small town, was an act of desperate loyalty. Decades earlier, Athens had defended Plataea from the encroachments of the powerful Thebes, and now the Plataeans had come to repay their debt by taking up the most dangerous position on the left flank. Their presence transformed the battle from a purely Athenian affair into a symbol of pan-Hellenic solidarity in the face of the barbarian threat. This solidarity, however, did not extend to internal Athenian politics. Miltiades' main opponents, the Alcmeonidae clan, who were suspected of secretly sympathizing with the Persians, spread a rumor after the battle that it was they who had signaled the Persian fleet with a light from a mountain, urging them to attack the city. Although there was no evidence to support this, the poisonous seeds of mistrust had been sown. The victory at Marathon did not unite the Athenian elite. It only intensified the struggle for power, in which the hero of the battle ultimately fell victim. Although the myth of Darius's flight from a single name is an artistic exaggeration, Miltiades' real victories, his knowledge of the enemy and his tactical skill, did indeed strike fear into the Persians. His name became synonymous with a threat that changed the course of Greek history, reminding us that true strength comes from experience and courage. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, and see you again in the world of myths and their hidden truths.